The sun was setting over Copper Creek Valley when Rancher first heard the desperate splashing. He'd been riding the riverbank, checking his cattle's water access, when the sound cut through the evening stillness like a knife through leather. At 43, Rancher had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that something was terribly wrong. He spurred his horse toward the commotion, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A boy, no more than 12 years old, was thrashing in the murky waters of Copper Creek. But this wasn't just any drowning. Heavy iron shackles bound the child's wrists and ankles, dragging him down like anchors. Without hesitation, Rancher plunged into the frigid water. The current was stronger than it looked, and the boy was already going under for what might have been the last time. Rancher's weathered hands found the child's shirt just as the shackles pulled him beneath the surface. With strength born from years of ranch work, he hauled the unconscious boy to shore. As Rancher performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, water poured from the child's lungs. Finally, the boy's eyes fluttered open, wide, terrified, and completely silent. Not a word, not even a whimper. Just those haunting blue eyes that seemed to hold secrets too heavy for someone so young. The shackles were old but well-maintained, with strange markings etched into the iron. They weren't the kind used by law enforcement. These were something else entirely. Something that made Rancher's skin crawl as he examined them more closely. "What's your name, son?" Rancher asked gently, wrapping the shivering boy in his coat. But the child just stared at him, lips sealed as tight as a vault. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the boy's chattering teeth and the distant sound of cattle lowing. Rancher made a decision that would change everything. Instead of taking the boy directly to Sheriff Morrison in town, he brought him back to his isolated ranch. Something about those shackles, about the way the boy flinched when Rancher mentioned the authorities, told him this situation was more complicated than a simple case of child abuse. That night, as the boy slept fitfully in Rancher's spare room, strange things began to happen. 3 riders approached the ranch house under cover of darkness, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. They didn't knock. They simply circled the property like vultures, their horses' hooves barely making a sound on the hard-packed earth. Rancher watched from his window, rifle in hand, as the mysterious riders seemed to be searching for something, or someone. When dawn broke, they were gone, leaving only hoof prints and an ominous feeling that this was far from over. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Doc Henley, the town's physician, arrived with Sheriff Morrison and Mayor Blackwood. Word had somehow spread about the rescue, though Rancher couldn't figure out how. "We heard you pulled a boy from the creek," Sheriff Morrison said, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "We need to take him into protective custody." "Protective custody?" Rancher's eyes narrowed. "From what?" "That's not your concern," Mayor Blackwood interjected, his expensive suit looking out of place on the dusty ranch. "The boy needs proper care, medical attention. You've done your good deed, Rancher. Now let the authorities handle this." But when they tried to approach the boy, something extraordinary happened. The child, who had been silent as a stone, suddenly spoke, not words, but a sound that chilled everyone to the bone. It was a low, keening wail that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, a sound of pure terror directed specifically at the 3 men. Doc Henley stepped back, his face pale. Maybe we should give the boy more time to recover." After they left, Rancher knelt beside the trembling child. "You know them, don't you?" he asked quietly. The boy's eyes met his, and for just a moment, Rancher saw something that made his blood boil: recognition and absolute fear. That evening, as Rancher prepared dinner, he noticed the boy had drawn something in the dirt outside. It was crude, but unmistakable: a church with a cross, and beside it, figures that looked like they were kneeling. But these weren't figures in prayer. They were figures in chains. As night fell over Copper Creek Valley, Rancher realized he wasn't just harboring a rescued child. He was protecting a witness to something so dark, so unthinkable, that powerful people were willing to kill to keep it secret. The question was, how far would they go to silence a 12-year-old boy forever? The wind picked up, rattling the windows of the ranch house, and somewhere in the distance, Rancher could swear he heard the sound of approaching horses. The boy heard it too, because he grabbed Rancher's arm with surprising strength and pointed toward the root cellar, the one place on the ranch where someone could hide and never be found. As Rancher helped the boy into the hidden space beneath his kitchen floor, one thought echoed in his mind. Whatever this child had witnessed, it was worth killing for, and that meant tomorrow, when the sun rose over Copper Creek Valley, the real battle would begin. Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly, just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story. Dawn brought more than just sunlight to Rancher's property. It brought Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the town's most influential gossip and wife of the bank president. She arrived in her pristine buggy, claiming to bring Christian charity in the form of fresh-baked bread and relentless questions. Such a terrible thing, finding that poor child in such a state, she said, her eyes scanning the ranch house like a hawk searching for prey. Where did you say those awful shackles came from? Rancher hadn't said, and he wasn't about to start now. Just glad the boy's safe, Mrs. Hartwell. But Eleanor Hartwell wasn't easily deterred. You know, my husband mentioned the strangest thing. Apparently there's been some inventory discrepancies at the bank. Nothing major, you understand, but curious timing, wouldn't you say? The implication hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. Rancher felt his jaw tighten. Are you suggesting this boy is connected to bank robbery? Oh, heavens, no, she exclaimed, but her eyes told a different story. I'm simply saying that sometimes children, well, they can be used by unscrupulous adults for all sorts of terrible purposes. After she left, Rancher found the boy sitting by the window, having witnessed the entire exchange. For the first time since the rescue, the child spoke. Not words, but he pointed to his own chest, then made a gesture as if he were writing. Rancher quickly brought paper and pencil. With shaking hands, the boy wrote, "Not thief. They made me watch." "Watch what?" Rancher wrote back. The boy's pencil hovered over the paper for a long moment before he scrawled, "Sunday meetings, basement, children." A chill ran down Rancher's spine. Sunday meetings could only mean one thing in a town like Copper Creek: church gatherings. But what kind of church meetings required children to be shackled? That afternoon brought an unexpected ally. Sarah Mackenzie, the school teacher, arrived on horseback, her usually neat appearance disheveled with urgency. She was one of the few people in town Rancher trusted completely. "I need to tell you something," she said, glancing around nervously. "About 3 months ago, I noticed some of my students changing. Tommy Brennan, little Mary Foster, the Peterson twins. They became withdrawn, started having nightmares. When I asked their parents, they all gave me the same answer: The children were receiving special religious instruction on Sunday evenings. What kind of instruction? Rancher asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. That's just it. Nobody would tell me. But last month, Tommy Brennan tried to run away from home. When they brought him back, he had marks on his wrists. Rope burns, they said, from trying to climb out his bedroom window. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Rancher, I think that boy you rescued, I think he escaped from something terrible, and I think other children are still trapped. As if summoned by their conversation, the boy appeared in the doorway. When he saw Sarah, his face lit up with the first genuine emotion Rancher had seen from him: hope. The child ran to the schoolteacher and buried his face in her skirt, his small body shaking with silent sobs. "It's all right, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, stroking his hair. "You're safe now." But even as she spoke those words, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. This time it wasn't 3 mysterious riders. It was a full posse, led by Sheriff Morrison and including several of the town's most prominent citizens: Mayor Blackwood, Bank President Hartwell, and most surprisingly Reverend Cornelius Ashford, the town's beloved pastor. "This has gone far enough, Rancher," Sheriff Morrison called out. "That boy is a material witness in a serious crime. We have a warrant for his custody." "What crime?" Rancher demanded, stepping protectively in front of Sarah. "And the child." Reverend Ashford stepped forward, his usually kind face stern with authority. "The boy is suspected of stealing from the church collection. Several families have reported missing jewelry and money after Sunday services. We believe he's been working with a gang of thieves who use children to gain access to homes and businesses." It was a perfect lie, believable, sympathetic to the boy's age, and impossible to disprove without revealing what the child had actually witnessed. But Rancher saw through it immediately. If he's just a thief, why was he shackled and thrown in the river? Rancher asked. Obviously, his criminal associates decided he was a liability, Mayor Blackwood replied smoothly. They tried to eliminate him to prevent him from exposing their operation. The boy pressed closer to Sarah, and Rancher could feel the child's terror radiating like heat from a forge. Whatever these men were hiding, it was worth destroying a child's life to protect. "I want to see that warrant," Rancher said. Sheriff Morrison handed over an official-looking document, but as Rancher examined it, he noticed something crucial. The warrant was dated yesterday, but it described the boy as approximately 12 years old. Brown hair, blue eyes, scar on left hand. Rancher glanced at the child's hands. There was indeed a small scar on his left hand, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. How could they have known about that scar unless they'd seen the boy before he was supposedly found stealing? "This warrant is very detailed," Rancher said carefully. "We're thorough in our investigations," Reverend Ashford replied. But there was something in his eyes that made Rancher's blood run cold. As the posse prepared to take the boy, Sarah Mackenzie did something that surprised everyone. She stepped forward and announced, "I'm invoking my rights as a certified educator in this territory. Any child suspected of criminal activity has the right to educational assessment before being placed in custody. It's territorial law." It was a desperate gambit, but it worked. The men exchanged uncertain glances. None of them wanted to be seen violating territorial education statutes, especially with an election coming up. "You have 24 hours, Sheriff Morrison said finally. Then the Boy comes with us. Assessment or no assessment? As the posse rode away, Rancher realized they'd bought themselves one day to uncover the truth. But as he watched the boy's reaction to the departing men, the way the child's eyes followed Reverend Ashford with particular terror, he began to understand that the truth they were seeking might be more horrifying than anyone in Copper Creek could imagine. That night, as Sarah stayed to help watch over the boy, they made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the child's torn clothing was a small piece of metal, not iron like the shackles, but silver. And engraved on it was a symbol that made Sarah gasp in recognition. "That's the seal of the Copper Creek Children's Moral Society," she whispered. "It's Reverend Ashford's special ministry. He started it 6 months ago for troubled children in the community." The boy saw them examining the silver piece and began to write frantically. "Basement, Sunday, more children, help them." As the implications sank in, Rancher realized that tomorrow's confrontation wouldn't just be about saving one boy. It would be about exposing a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of Copper Creek's most trusted institutions. And with less than 24 hours to gather evidence, they were running out of time to save not just one child, but potentially dozens of others. The wind howled outside the ranch house, and in the distance, church bells began to toll midnight. Sunday was coming, and with it another meeting of the Children's Moral Society. The question was, would they be able to stop it in time? Sunday morning arrived with an eerie stillness that seemed to blanket Copper Creek like a funeral shroud. Rancher had spent the sleepless night formulating a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, possibly both. With Sarah's help, they would infiltrate the church during the evening special service and gather evidence of whatever horrors were taking place in that basement. But first, they had to survive the day. The boy had finally revealed his name through careful writing: Timothy Walsh. He'd been living with his grandmother on the outskirts of town when Reverend Ashford approached them about the special ministry. His grandmother, desperate for help with the increasingly troubled child after his parents' death, had agreed to let Timothy participate in the Sunday evening sessions. "The first time was just talking," Timothy wrote, his hand shaking as he formed the letters. "Reverend said I was special. Said God had plans for me. Then came the basement. Said it was secret prayers. But prayers don't need chains." Sarah had to step outside to compose herself after reading Timothy's account. When she returned, her face was set with grim determination. "We need proof," she said. "Something that will make the territorial authorities listen." That's when Rancher revealed his plan. "Tonight, during the service, I'll create a distraction at the front of the church. Sarah, you'll slip around to the basement entrance. There's an old root cellar door on the north side that connects to the church foundation. Timothy will stay here, safe." But Timothy shook his head violently and wrote, "Other children still there. They need help now." The boy's desperation was heartbreaking, but it also gave Rancher an idea. "What if we could get them out during the service? If the adults are all upstairs—" "Too dangerous," Sarah protested. "We don't know how many people are involved." Their planning was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, Dr. Henley, arriving alone and looking haggard. He dismounted his horse with the weariness of a man carrying a terrible burden. "I need to tell you something," he said without preamble, "about the other children." Rancher and Sarah exchanged glances. "What other children?" "The ones I've been treating for injuries. Rope burns, malnutrition, trauma symptoms. I've been documenting everything, but I was too much of a coward to speak up." His voice broke. When I saw that boy's reaction to the sheriff and mayor yesterday, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Dr. Henley pulled out a leather journal filled with medical notes. 7 children in the past 6 months, all participants in Reverend Ashford's special ministry, all showing signs of systematic abuse and psychological trauma. Why didn't you report this? Sarah demanded. To who? Sheriff Morrison's brother-in-law is the church treasurer. Mayor Blackwood donated the money for the basement renovation. Half the town council attends those Sunday services. Dr. Henley's hands shook as he spoke. I thought if I documented everything, eventually I'd find someone in the territorial government who would listen. Timothy had been reading over their shoulders, and now he wrote urgently. Tonight is different. Reverend said special ceremony, all children together. The implications hit them like a physical blow. Whatever had been happening to these children individually was about to escalate into something far worse. We need help, Rancher said. Someone with authority who isn't connected to the local power structure. Dr. Henley nodded. There's a territorial marshal in Silver Ridge, about 2 hours' ride, but he'd never make it back in time for tonight. Then we do this ourselves, Sarah said with quiet steel in her voice. As afternoon faded into evening, they put their desperate plan into motion. Dr. Henley would position himself near the church's main entrance, ready to provide medical assistance to any children they rescued. Sarah would slip into the basement through the old root cellar entrance. Rancher would create a distraction by confronting Reverend Ashford publicly about the special ministry. But as they prepared to leave the ranch, Timothy made one final heartbreaking request. He wrote, "Let me help. I know the way. Other children trust me." Against every instinct, they agreed. Timothy would guide Sarah through the basement while Rancher kept the adults occupied upstairs. The church was packed that evening with families arriving for what they believed was a regular Sunday service. But Rancher noticed something chilling. Several parents dropped off their children and left immediately, as if they knew this wasn't a service they should witness. As Reverend Ashford began his sermon about cleansing the innocent, Rancher and Timothy slipped around to the north side of the building. The old root cellar door was exactly where Rancher remembered, hidden behind overgrown bushes and secured with a heavy padlock. "Stand back," Rancher whispered, producing a crowbar from his coat. The lock broke with a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud in the evening stillness. Below them, a narrow staircase led into darkness. And from that darkness came the sound that would haunt Rancher for the rest of his life, the quiet whimpering of terrified children. Timothy grabbed Rancher's hand and squeezed it once, then disappeared into the basement like a ghost returning to face his demons. Sarah followed, her teacher's instincts overriding her fear. Rancher waited exactly 5 minutes, then walked through the church's front doors. The congregation was singing a hymn, but their voices seemed muted, as if the very air was thick with secrets. Rancher walked down the center aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, until he stood directly in front of the pulpit. "Reverend Ashford," he called out, his voice cutting through the hymn like a blade. "I'd like to ask you about your special ministry." The singing stopped abruptly. Every face in the congregation turned toward him, and Rancher saw a mixture of confusion, fear, and, in some faces, guilt. "This is highly irregular," Reverend Ashford said, but there was something in his eyes that looked almost like relief. "Perhaps we could discuss this after the service." "I think we should discuss it now," Rancher replied. especially the part about children being kept in your basement. The church erupted in shocked murmurs, but Rancher pressed on. 7 children, documented by Dr. Henley as showing signs of systematic abuse, all participants in your Children's Moral Society. That's when Sheriff Morrison stood up from his pew, hand on his gun. That's enough, Rancher. You're disturbing a religious service. But before the sheriff could act, a new voice cut through the tension. Sarah's voice, calling from somewhere beneath the church. Rancher, we need help down here. There are 6 children and they're all chained. The congregation exploded into chaos. Some people rushed toward the basement entrance, others toward the exits. In the confusion, Rancher saw Mayor Blackwood trying to slip out the back door, and Bank President Hartwell frantically whispering to his wife. But it was Reverend Ashford's reaction that confirmed everything. The man who had preached about moral purity and Christian values collapsed to his knees behind the pulpit, tears streaming down his face. I never meant for it to go this far, he sobbed. They said it was just discipline, just teaching them proper respect for authority. Who said that? Rancher demanded, but he already knew the answer. As territorial marshals arrived, summoned by Dr. Henley's earlier message, the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. The Children's Moral Society had been a cover for something far more sinister, a systematic program of child abuse designed to create compliant, terrified young servants for the town's elite families. But the most shocking revelation came when they found the basement's hidden room, where detailed records had been kept of every child, every session, and every family that had participated. The conspiracy reached far beyond Copper Creek, connecting to similar operations in 3 other towns. As the children were finally freed from their chains and reunited with their horrified parents, the ones who hadn't known, who had trusted their community leaders, Timothy Walsh stood beside Rancher and wrote one final message. Thank you for believing me. But even as justice began to unfold, Rancher knew their ordeal wasn't over. The territorial investigation would take months, and there were still powerful people who would do anything to escape accountability. The real test of Copper Creek's character was just beginning. 3 weeks after the basement revelations, Copper Creek was a town divided against itself. The territorial investigation had uncovered evidence of the conspiracy in 4 towns across the territory, leading to arrests that reached into the highest levels of local government. But with great revelations came great resistance from those who had built their power on the suffering of children. Rancher found himself at the center of a storm he never could have imagined. Half the town viewed him as a hero who had saved their children from unthinkable horrors. The other half saw him as a troublemaker who had destroyed their community's reputation and economic stability. The bank had closed pending investigation. The church was empty, and several prominent families had fled in the night. Timothy Walsh had been placed in Sarah Mackenzie's temporary custody, while the territorial authorities searched for surviving relatives. The boy was slowly beginning to speak aloud, though he still preferred writing for important communications. His recovery was remarkable, but the other children were struggling more. Some had been in the program for over a year. The morning that would change everything began with an unexpected visitor. Judge Harrison Blackthorne, the territorial circuit judge who had been assigned to oversee the prosecutions. He was a stern man in his 60s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. "Mr. Rancher," Judge Blackthorne said, settling into a chair on the ranch house porch. "I've reviewed all the evidence, interviewed all the witnesses, and I have some questions that only you can answer." Timothy, who had been feeding the chickens nearby, immediately moved closer to Rancher's side. The boy's protective instincts toward his rescuer had only grown stronger over the past weeks. "Ask away, Judge. The conspiracy we've uncovered is extensive, but there's still one piece missing. The financial records show large payments coming from outside the territory. Someone was funding this operation on a scale that suggests it was more than just local corruption." Rancher felt a chill run down his spine. "You'd think this was bigger than just Copper Creek?" "I think this was a testing ground," Judge Blackthorne said grimly. "And I think someone is still out there. Someone with enough power and money to make all our witnesses disappear if they choose to." As if summoned by the judge's words, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, riders approaching fast. But these weren't local men. These were professionals, dressed in black suits and riding expensive horses. At their head was a man Rancher had never seen before. Tall, pale, with the kind of cold eyes that suggested he'd never felt genuine human emotion. "That's Cornelius Ashford's brother," Judge Blackthorne said quietly. "Marcus Ashford. He's a federal prosecutor from back east, and he's here to make all of this go away." The riders stopped at the ranch gate, and Marcus Ashford dismounted with the fluid grace of a predator. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Judge Blackthorne, I'm here to inform you that this case is being transferred to federal jurisdiction. All evidence, all witnesses, and all suspects are to be turned over to my custody immediately." "On whose authority?" Judge Blackthorne demanded. Marcus Ashford produced an official-looking document. "The Attorney General's office. This case involves interstate criminal activity and potential threats to national security." Rancher felt Timothy's small hand slip into his. The boy was trembling, but not with fear, with rage. Timothy pulled out his ever-present pencil and paper and wrote quickly, "He was there, first meeting, told Reverend what to do." The revelation hit Rancher like a physical blow. Marcus Ashford hadn't come to investigate the conspiracy. He'd come to cover it up because he was part of it, possibly the architect of it. "Judge," Rancher said carefully, "I think we need to have a longer conversation about this case." But Marcus Ashford had seen Timothy's note, his cold eyes fixed on the boy with unmistakable menace. "That child is clearly traumatized and unreliable. He'll be placed in a federal facility where he can receive proper treatment." "Like hell he will," Rancher growled, stepping protectively in front of Timothy. That's when Sarah Mackenzie emerged from the house, carrying a leather satchel that Rancher recognized as Dr. Henley's medical journal. But she wasn't alone. Behind her came Dr. Henley himself, along with Sheriff Morrison and, most surprisingly, Reverend Cornelius Ashford. "Before anyone goes anywhere," Sarah announced, "there's something you all need to hear." Reverend Ashford stepped forward, his face gaunt from weeks of guilt and sleepless nights. "I've been talking with Dr. Henley and Judge Blackthorne about my brother's involvement in this abomination. Marcus didn't just fund the operation, he designed it." Marcus Ashford's composure cracked for the first time. "Cornelius, you're clearly suffering from a mental breakdown. No one will believe—" "They'll believe this," Dr. Henley interrupted, producing a small recording device that Rancher had never seen before. "I've been documenting everything, including my conversations with your brother about expanding the program to other territories." The recording that followed was damning beyond any doubt. Marcus Ashford's voice, cold and calculating, discussing the training program for children, the profits to be made from properly conditioned domestic servants, and his plans to establish similar operations across the Western territories. But the most chilling part came at the end, when Marcus's recorded voice said, "The beauty of using religious institutions is that people trust them implicitly, and if anyone gets too curious, well, accidents happen to troublemakers all the time out here." As the recording ended, Timothy Walsh did something that surprised everyone. He walked directly up to Marcus Ashford and, in a clear, strong voice, spoke his first complete sentence since his rescue. "You told them I was special. You told them God wanted me to suffer. But you're not God, and you're not special. You're just a man who hurts children." The words hung in the air like a judgment from heaven itself. Marcus Ashford made one last desperate play, reaching